Hey guys, it's me. Uh, Starting our first recorded lecture. This is the third time I've tried to record this. The first time there was no audio. The second time it was supposed to be 30 minutes and I went 50 minutes and my face was in the way. So the third time's going to be the charm. I feel it. Now, this is only supposed to be a 30-minute lecture, so feel free that if I pass 30 minutes, go ahead and just stop listening. It's all right. But we're talking about the Cold War today, and I told you this in my message on Canvas that I would do a little bit of the new stuff and then also do some reviews. So this is our new stuff for the week. We're going to learn about the Cold War. You're going to read about the Cold War in an article, and then you're going to do some review on the Gilded Age. So let's get started so I can use my 30 minutes wisely. Um, when we talk about the Cold War, there are really three eras of the Cold War. Three. All right. When we think about the Cold War, it's from 1945 to 1992. It's a massive time period. So when we want to kind of break it down in our heads, 1945 to 1963, 64-ish is what we call the early Cold War, and that's what we're covering today with Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. Then 1964 to 1980-ish. That's a period where Vietnam in the 1960s and detente. And then from 1980 to 1992 would be the last little section of the Cold War, and that's with Reagan and the conservatives and the kind of reinvigorated Cold War fight. Um, so just be aware of that we're really just covering the first third of this event. But it's an event that I think we're still dealing with a lot of fallout from. We still have to deal with all the nuclear weapons. We still have to deal with tensions with Russia. We still have to deal with the fact that the United States, for a while, was kind of singular in its world power after the fall of the Soviet Union. But also we have the rise of the Chinese. Um, uh, of the Chinese, and so that's going to be a kind of a new tension that we see going on, which in the 21st century. So I think this is all kind of super relevant right now. So I think it's important for us to take some time and do that. Anytime we talk about the Cold War, we always have to make sure that we're talking about the context. If I were to ask you what was the relationship of the United States and Russia from, I don't know, the 18th century until the 20th century, I think most of you would probably say, what? But those of you that remember the brief mention of this, all right, the relationship between the two sides was fairly amicable, all right. You had the Russians were located in Alaska and along the western coast of North America. But the United States always tended to have a good relationship with them because of the legacy of John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams would say was very much a favorite of the Russian Tsar. And so for the 18th and 19th century, the United States and Russia were fairly peaceful. And then the 20th century, that changes. And you can see the list of events that are going on here. And what these lists of events basically explain to us is the change over time, that we go from this kind of peaceful, amicable relationship to a relationship with friction and tension and distrust. And a lot of it centered around the Bolshevik Revolution in the 19 teens, and then the U.S. reaction to the rise of a communist state with the Red Scare. And then, of course, the tension centered around World War II. They were uneasy allies. You can see in this picture right here. There's FDR. There's Stalin. They're uneasy allies. They tend to get along so much as they hate Hitler, but they don't really like each other. And there's going to be a lot of tension that rises from that World War II. The biggest thing that comes out of World War II as far as tension and distrust is, of course, America in the British delaying a second front in France, and then the Manhattan Project. Both of them tend to create distrust on the Soviet side. And then the Soviets spying on the United States will create distrust on that side. And it all comes to a head kind of at Yalta. Yalta is a conference right there at the very end of World War II. This is a picture from Yalta, the last time the big three were together there. And it's at Yalta that really Stalin uses his power in Eastern Europe to formulate what the post-war world is going to look like. And the post-war world is going to look like a split in Europe, in which the eastern section of Europe is going to be controlled as a sphere of influence by the Soviets, and the western section will be more under the control of the British and the Americans. And that's going to create a massive tension. It also focuses on Germany and the split of Germany into East and West, which also causes a lot of tension. All right, so that's the context. And remember, anytime we talk about a big historical event like this, we always have to understand kind of what's leading to it. And we also have to understand the agency of the people who are making decisions on this. So when we talk about what the Cold War really is, you have to understand that both the Soviet Union and the United States are coming at it from their own personal histories. All right, the United States just coming out of the Great Depression and into World War II. They had had a period of peace and prosperity in the 1920s, but on reflection, many thinkers in the United States felt that the United States not joining the League of Nations and not becoming a world leader after World War I really caused the chain of events that led to World War II. So the United States is coming at this from a position that it needs to be a world power, it needs to be a world leader, and it needs to do things to grow its economy so that a Great Depression doesn't happen again. And so then on the other side, you have the Soviet Union, who just came out of this horrific war in which 25 million Russians die. This is the second war in the last 40 years where millions of Russians have died. And if you go all the way back to the Napoleonic era and the Crimean War and all sorts of things, you have these kind of constant reminders that the western portion of Europe was always kind of hostile to Russia and the eastern portion of Europe. And so the Russians are really coming at this from a perspective of we need to make sure that we are protected from Western aggression. And so what we end up seeing is this kind of imperial competition in which the United States and the Soviet Union, the two main industrial superpowers after World War II, are expanding their influence for various reasons, whether it's protection or it's economy, that they're expanding their influence into what they call third world countries. And this, I think, is very important when we talk about the Cold War. A lot of people are like, well, the Soviet Union's always trying to get into Latin America. No, never. The Soviet Union does not try to get into Latin America because that's the United States sphere of influence. And they're like, well, the United States is always trying to get into Eastern Europe. Again, not a thing. The United States stays out of Eastern Europe because that's the Soviet sphere of influence. So really what they're fighting over are all these African and Asian countries who are coming out of the colonial period and starting to declare independence. And in US and Soviet estimation, this is the kind of the new imperialism, to take over these countries, not militarily, not territorially, not even by taking over their government, but instead take over economically and culturally, and just get them to support one side or the other. And that's really the fight that we see going on here. And that fight is at the highest levels of geopolitical power, but also at the lowest levels of culture and society. And you see that fight, that propaganda, that division of us versus them in kind of every sense of American culture. A lot of new weapons are developed, and I'm not talking just about the arms race with the atomic weapons and the hydrogen bombs and so forth, but really when we think about what the Cold War is, it's a very new type of imperialism. It's about propaganda, winning the hearts and minds of these newly independent countries. It's about fighting each other, but not directly, so through proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan. And it's about using resources that are newly created out of World War II, the CIA and the KGB, which allows for both sides to get a lot of intel and information about each other, but also to destabilize countries and to overthrow regimes. And so all these new kind of weapons are being deployed for what, if you kind of cut down to the base of it, is a very basic imperial competition between the two. That being said, the rhetoric is fairly high on both sides, as both sides kind of claim freedom and democracy as their ultimate calling. And I know for many people in the United States, it's hard to see the Soviet Union as this kind of purveyor of democracy, but they would argue that. They would argue that they were democratic, that communism was the People's Party. And I think they would, they would argue that the United States wasn't democratic due to Jim Crow and some of the voting restriction rights that we had in the United States. So just to be aware that perspectives, like when we look at this, we have to kind of divorce ourselves from our own bias about whether we like the United States or we don't like the United States, or we like communism or don't like communism, and really kind of cut to the core of what it is that they're actually doing here. And I think maybe this is probably the best cartoon to do that. I think both sides have legitimate arguments that the other side is being aggressive. I think both sides have legitimate arguments that they're trying to take over parts of the world, because I think both sides are doing that. It's an imperial competition. We could go back to the 19th century and look at imperialism in the 19th century, and we'd see a lot of similar things that are happening. All right, whether it's, we're talking about Britain, France, and Germany, or now we're talking about the Soviet Union and the United States, just very different, actors, but similar goals in the end. So as we talk about this first period of the Cold War, it's easy to divide by three presidents. You have Harry S. Truman, who was president after FDR dies. Then you have Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had been supreme commander of the U.S. and Allied forces during D-Day and helped win the war in Europe. And then you have John F. Kennedy, who was a Massachusetts senator who was rich and helped buy his way into office. So these are the three presidents, and they are going to each have a very different way of understanding this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Truman starts us out. He starts us out with the atomic bombs and dropping the atomic bombs. That really kind of kicks off the Cold War. But in his estimation, the Cold War was really about containment. It's about trying to stop the spread of communism. And he succeeds in some areas and he fails in others. Like he stops the spread of communism into South Korea. He stops the spread of communism in Western Europe with the Marshall Plan. He stops the spread of communism into Western Berlin with the Berlin Airlift. He helped stop the spread of communism into Greece and Turkey with the Truman Doctrine and the use of American funds to help fight communist aggression. But he also fails to understand the nationalistic fervor of the communists in China, and China will turn into a communist nation under Truman's administration. But his estimation is that in order for communism to be killed or stopped, it has to be contained and not allowed to spread. And that's going to be kind of a philosophy that the United States uses going forward, that we have to stop communism from spreading. And in order to do that, in order to contain communism, we must have the largest, most powerful military. And that's really what NSC 68 is all about. It creates the policy of the United States to have a military second to none. So when you ask yourself, why do we spend so much money on the military today? One of the first answers we have to give is the NSC 68, which helps create a military-industrial complex that we'll talk about more with Eisenhower. All right. Now, NSC 68 wouldn't go anywhere without Korea. I think Korea is a very important but little-known war. It is not really a Cold War proxy war in the way that we like to think of it as. The United States truly misunderstood what was happening in Korea, just like it misunderstood what was happening in China. Both China and Korea, later Vietnam and other areas, when we see these kind of communist revolutions, they're not being sponsored or driven by Moscow and by the Soviet Union. Instead, they're typically nationalistic, and they're coming out of this hatred of foreign influence. So think about China. You go back to the Opium Wars, you go back to the spheres of influence and the Open Door Note and the Boxer Rebellion. There has been like a history of outside invaders who have basically controlled China, and like the tipping point was the invasion by the Japanese during World War II. And so Chairman Mao uses that kind of hatred of these foreign invasions and creates a populist message that happens to be communist, and overthrows the more U.S. centered and U.S. backed national party, and that's going to create tension between the United States and China that will last until the 1970s. But Korea is the same way, right? Korea is divided into two halves after World War II, the more Soviet-backed northern half that has communist tendencies, and the southern-backed, the U.S.-backed southern half. In 1950, the northern half of Korea will start a civil war to unify the peninsula. The United States will not understand this as a civil war, but will instead see this as Soviet aggression to take over southern Korea. And so, using the backing of the United Nations, the U.S. will bring in forces and they will push back into North Korea. Now, they put in charge a very fiery general named Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur is told not to go past this 38th parallel right here, but he does anyways. And that upsets China. China will enter the war in 1951, and that creates the stalemate that we see right here. And that stalemate has lasted. Up until today, you still have the demilitarized zone and the division between North and South Korea. And while there are every now and then movements to kind of unify the Korean Peninsula, I think there's still a lot of work that has to be done in that area. Now, a couple of big lessons that come out of Korea. Again, we are seeing the United States misunderstand nationalistic movements. We are also seeing the limitations of America's power militarily, that it doesn't want to get into big wars with Soviet Union and China, and these proxy wars are kind of be where we stick at throughout most of this. It will also be the end of Harry Truman's presidency. Truman decides not to run again in 1952, and instead Eisenhower will run as Republican and win by a fairly large margin. If you get a chance, open up the PowerPoint. You can watch the first political ad by Eisenhower. It's a nice little cartoon with a little jingle to it. But Eisenhower wins because he seems to be a stable force and one that understands conflict. And he understands that Americans are upset with the war in Korea. He promises that if he is elected president, he will go to Korea. He doesn't tell the people what he's going to do, just that he's going to go. He goes to Korea, and then he comes back and they negotiate a ceasefire. All right, and the ceasefire is exactly the way it is today. Okay, and it's the situation that just has a hard time changing. And I'm not really sure exactly where that's going to go. And I think there has been some movement in the last few years, and we'll see if that will continue or not. So when Eisenhower comes in, he doesn't want to stick to just containment. He wants to shift that. He wants to go to something bigger. Him and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, will come up with the concept of massive retaliation. And that means exactly what it says, that instead of arguing that we're going to send in small troops or, in ground forces into conflicts, his argument is that, hey, we have nuclear weapons, so we're going to use them if you choose to defy us. And he and his Secretary of Defense will argue the use of nuclear weapons a couple of times, but at all times, whenever that happens, remember we talked about MAD, mutually assured destruction, that will always win out. Both sides will always kind of back down when faced with that ultimate decision whether to destroy humanity or not. One way that he changed the military was he put a lot more effort and a lot more attention and resources into what's called the Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command were these massive bombers that would fly around the world pretty much all the time, and they allowed the United States to always have the capability of striking no matter what. So if for some reason the Soviets sent a missile and attacked the United States, then we'd have the bombers ready to go and bomb different strategic places in the Soviet Union. So, and this is the world on the edge, right? Like what we're seeing here is both sides playing this brinkmanship game in which they're just staring at each other across the chasm and seeing who's going to blink first, who's going to attack first. Other things that he does besides massive retaliation is he argues that one of the things the United States has to do is win the hearts and minds of the Eastern Europeans and the Soviet bloc. And so he pushes for a larger propaganda message, whether it's Radio Free Europe or Voices of America. And they would actually have these ships that would float around in the ocean close enough to the shores in order to spread this message of American culture and American values into Soviet-controlled areas. All right. one of the biggest things that Eisenhower is known for, as he leaves the presidency in 1961, he will give a farewell address. It's probably the most famous farewell address besides Washington's, and it's there that he argues that Americans need to be worried about a military-industrial complex. Going back to the NSC 68, when we talk about why is the military so powerful, why are the budgets so high, a big part of that is because of this military-industrial complex in which defense contractors are lobbying Congress and basically shaping policy that requires the United States to continue spending a massive amount of money. And their argument always, the lobbyist arguments are always, if you cut budgets in the military, it will cause job loss. And there's this ultimate fear of returning to the Great Depression. So the United States will constantly spend more money on defense contracts in the military in order to keep the economy floating. And this comes from a interesting interpretation of what caused the end of the Great Depression. If you look at it, the Great Depression ends because of New Deal and because of the natural business cycle. But because of World War II and the massive defense spending that occurs because of World War II, the economy takes off in the 1940s and into the 50s. And people are now convinced that that was what caused the end of the Great Depression, when it really wasn't. And that's something that I think we still deal with a lot today. Eisenhower's big events that happened during his presidency. He has two coups. Both coups are very similar, just in two different parts of the world, one in Latin America and one in Iran. The two coups give us a glimpse into how the CIA is being used. Both in Iran and Guatemala, you have a left-leaning president that's elected popularly by the people. Because they're leftist-leaning, they tended to want to nationalize industries. So, for example, in Iran, Mossadegh wanted to take the oil fields and nationalize them, take them away from the Seven Sisters. And that upset the private companies in both Britain and the United States. And you're going to see the CIA and the go in and destabilize the country and overthrow the president who had been elected. Same thing in Guatemala, just with fruit companies. The overthrow of these democratically elected things. So that's where we go back to that idea of rhetoric, that we talk about the rhetoric, but in reality, the United States is not backing democracy. It's backing people who just support the United States. We see that both in Iran and Guatemala. He also has two revolutions that occur under his administration, the Hungarian Revolution in 56 and then the Cuban Revolution in 58 and 59. And both give us a glimpse into that idea of spheres of influence. In Hungary, you have the Eisenhower Doctrine, in which he says, we are going to support whoever is opposing communism with military force. But when Hungary opposes the Soviet Union with military force, he says, no, never mind, we're not sending in the military. All right, he kind of backtracks on this idea of the Eisenhower Doctrine. He does that because he understands that is the Soviet sphere. We're not going to be able to move into that sphere, and the Soviets will put down the revolution pretty brutally, as you can see by this cartoon here. The other revolution is the Cuban Revolution and the rise of Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro is not a communist. He's a traditional strongman who just wanted control of Cuba and wanted to kick out the foreign influence, very similar to what we saw in China and other revolutions. And the problem is, though, his brother Raul is very much a communist, and his best friend Che Guevara is very much a communist. And so when the Cuban Revolution succeeds and Fidel Castro overthrows the U.S.-supported dictator Batista, and the U.S. corporations are kicked out, and the organized crime syndicates are kicked out of Cuba. This upsets Eisenhower, and the fact that he has these kind of communist-backed friends in Raul and Che will lead Eisenhower to cut off relations with Cuba, and so Cuba will look towards the Soviet Union for help. The Soviet Union was not involved in the revolution really until that happened. Right, but again, that's because Cuba is considered part of the United States sphere of influence, while Hungary is considered part of the Soviet sphere. I think the other big thing that we have to really get out of Eisenhower's presidency is Sputnik. Sputnik was the first man-made satellite to be launched. It was launched by the Soviets, and it orbited the Earth for a few days. this will upset Americans immediately. They think that it's a spy satellite or a nuclear weapon that the Soviets have launched. But once they back up, they start thinking, why did the Soviets beat the United States to space? And this will lead Eisenhower into really upping STEM education and STEM funding in the United States with the National Defense Education Act. And you'll start seeing the United States enter into that space race a little bit more intentionally. All right. Now, by the end of Eisenhower's presidency, it looked like things were going to get better, right? You had the kitchen debates in July of 1959 in which Nixon kind of wows Khrushchev here, and they really have a good time talking about the merits of both the Soviet and the American system. It's also here that Nixon basically forecasts why the United States will win this war. He says that in the end, toasters beat rockets, that the Soviets may have better rockets, but we have better toasters. Now I'll let you think about why that is, but in the end, Nixon was right. Toasters beat rockets. And then Khrushchev visited in September 1959. He went to Nebraska, he saw some corn, he went to LA and met some Hollywood stars. He wanted to go to Disneyland, but they wouldn't let him, right? So Khrushchev comes, he's the successor of Stalin. Stalin dies in 53, and then Khrushchev comes in, and it seems like by 59 things are getting better, but in then 1960 things get much worse with what's called the U-2 incident, as America is caught spying on the Soviets with high altitude U-2 spy planes. All right, and so what ends up happening is young John F. Kennedy wins the election in 1960, and he comes into a world in which the Cold War has gotten even worse, and the tension has gotten even worse. All right, and that's going to kind of define his presidency, is this foreign policy of the Cold War. He does shift America from massive retaliation to flexible response. He still believes that communism needs to be rolled back and contained, like Eisenhower and Truman, but he thinks that it can be done using special forces like the SEALs and the Green Berets, and that the United States does not have to threaten nuclear weapons every single time. He also believes that the United States should project its soft power even more than just through Voices of America and Radio Free Europe. So he creates the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps are these young 20-something college kids who go to African countries and they go to Latin American countries, and they are spreading American culture and consumerism, and also teaching about agriculture and reading. And the Peace Corps has been around for quite a while. I think it was just shut down because of the pandemic, but it had been around since the 1960s. And it's a way for America to spread its soft power, its culture, without having to do military maneuvers or territorial gains. He also will propose what's called the Alliance for Progress. Now, the Alliance for Progress was an attempt to recreate the Marshall Plan, but in Latin America. And it's not a very big success, but you do see that attempt to say, hey, listen, we are not going to constantly overthrow governments in Latin America. Instead, we are going to try to help out like we did in Europe. And he will push forward the continued space race that we see under Eisenhower, and he will guarantee America will go to the moon, or at least say that should be our goal. And the United States will get to the moon in 1969 if you believe that we went to the moon. All right. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to try to do this fairly quickly. When you think about JFK, I think everybody thinks immediately of Cuba. JFK's presidency is centered around, he's only in office for about 1,000 days, it's centered around the issues of Cuba. He's left kind of a mess whenever he comes in. Eisenhower had come up with a plan. Well, Eisenhower and the CIA had come up with a plan. So when Castro takes over Cuba, a whole lot of Cuban nationalists move out. They move to Miami, they move to Mexico, they move to Guatemala, they move out because they don't want to be killed by Castro. And and these nationalists are approached by the CIA, and the CIA says basically, we will provide you arms and training, and we will get you to Cuba, and you're going to start a counter-revolution. And this is what we call the Bay of Pigs. JFK signs off on it, says, okay, that sounds like a good deal. And it was just a way to overthrow Castro and to bring Cuba back into America's sphere of influence. It's terrible. It fails miserably from the start. A big problem here is that most of the nationalists have been talking about it, especially in Miami, in the area of Miami, Florida. And the Cuban papers in Miami were actually discussing the Bay of Pigs months before it happened. So Castro knew about it, and he was ready for it. He captured all the nationalists as they came on to the shore, and they all blamed the United States pretty quickly. All right, so that creates a tension between JFK and Castro and between the United States and Cuba. And then that tension is going to be increased in 1962 when the Soviets decide to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. This is what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the Soviets are doing this as a way of responding to America putting missiles in Turkey and some other places that were bordering on the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union is like, this would be a good spot to put some missiles because, look, you can now attack a lot of the major American cities. All right. Well, the United States, because of its spy planes, will find out about it before they're ready, and the United States will issue a ultimatum to the Soviet Union: get rid of the spy, or get rid of the nuclear weapons, or we are going to attack Cuba and get rid of them for you before they're ready. And Kennedy will put a quarantine on Cuba and will stop Soviet ships as they're coming in to make sure they're not carrying any more missile technology. And for 13 days, basically the world was on the brink. The world was probably as close as it was going to get to nuclear annihilation in those 13 days in October of 1962. And then an agreement was come to. And this agreement basically was that the United States will take the missiles out of Turkey in exchange for the missiles out of Cuba. And the Cuban Missile Crisis ends. Now, out of this comes kind of this moment of realization by both the United States and the Soviet Union that they were that close to annihilating all of humanity. So they're going to install a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin to make sure that the president and the leader of the Soviet Union can always speak to each other. And they will eventually sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which stops the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So those are ways in which you see kind of the brinkmanship and the MAD come together. The last thing that he's really known for is his response to the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall goes up in 1961, similar to the Berlin blockade earlier in the 1940s. The Berlin Wall was an attempt to keep East Berliners from moving to West Berlin in order to stop the flow of workers out of Eastern Germany. And it's very successful. It's very successful as far as doing what it was supposed to do, but it becomes this kind of symbol of oppression and symbol of separation between the Soviet Union and the Western the United States and the Western Europe. All right, and so he'll go to Berlin. He'll give a speech, the very famous speech. It's on the previous slide if you want to watch part of it. But in this speech, he says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which is not really how you say it in German, right? That just means I'm a donut. If he said "Ich bin Berliner," that means I am from Berlin. But you know what? No one holds it against him, except for me and some people who speak German. The last thing, and this is kind of where we end. I think 34 minutes is pretty good. When we talk about JFK, we can't divorce him from the fact that he takes us into Vietnam in a much bigger fashion than Eisenhower had taken us into Vietnam. Eisenhower kind of gets Vietnam rolling for the United States, and then JFK increases it. And then when JFK is assassinated in November 1963, that puts the issue of Vietnam into the lap of Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson is going to really take us to war. And so Vietnam in the 1960s really changed all of this stuff that we're talking about when it comes to the Cold War, because I think it's really one of the first big losses the United States had ever suffered, and that's going to really change the way the United States approaches proxy wars and the Cold War. So I'm going to save that for later. All right, I hope that this little jaunt through the Cold War made sense. If you have any questions, please email me or look at my office hours and call me, or we could do a little video conference or whatever necessary to ask questions about it. Go on here, you can watch the videos. I hope that you've had a productive day, and I will see you for the next video, which I'll record over the weekend, which will be the Period 6 review. All right, have fun.